Welcome to Dig Deep, the mining podcast. In this podcast, we go deep into mining news, hot topics, and live interviews with mining professionals and leading figures in the mining industry. Introducing your host, Rob Tyson, founder and director of Mining International and Mining International Executive, a leading global mining recruitment and headhunting agency.
Hi, mining community. Welcome back to another episode of the Dig Deep, the mining podcast. And today's guest is Steve Virtual, who is a communications and public affairs executive within the mining industry, with deep expertise providing leadership to the sector, whether that's junior miners, producers, or even mining suppliers. He brings 25 years of experience as a public affairs professional, having spent much of his time probably about 15 years working in and around the mining sector, helping to improve outcomes for some of the largest brands in mining. He brings exceptional skills in terms of government relations, communications, and stakeholder engagement on a professional level. He's an active listener to the podcast. He wants to discuss political risks in the mining industry. And obviously we've seen recent surge in government intervention around the world within our industry. And Steve wanted to provide some sort of content around this and how mining companies could possibly navigate their way around certain situations and present best market and present themselves within our industry, mining companies, whether you're a mining company, mining supplier, how you can best present yourself in the media to put yourself in the spotlight. So, Steve, welcome to the podcast. How you doing?
I'm great. Thanks for having me, Rob, and a happy new year to you.
Yeah, and yourself. We're recording this a few days into 2025. So anyone that's listening, hope you had a good 2025. And we were speaking off air, and certainly Steve did. So I wanted you to just tell us a little bit about yourself, a little bit about your career. As I mentioned, you've been in the industry for over 25 years in public affairs. So I just wanted you to just tell us a little bit about your career, a little bit about what you've done in the mining industry, so our audience knows a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Well, I think you've covered a number of things. My job, and I think that this is in mining parlance, a number of people who really don't understand the public affairs role within a mining company because they've been a bit spotty and hit or miss, I think. But my job really is to support the operations, right? The corporate interests, and promote maximum profitability by releasing and avoiding the pressures of the external ecosystem, meaning government and other exogenous variables. And so I work with the C-suite to define the priorities and the objectives, and really work with the operational teams, the site teams, technical teams, and other internal support mechanisms to define and really distribute what the public narrative should be. So what does that really mean? A lot of work in terms of government relations, which you've mentioned, public policy analysis, working with both elected and unelected officials and their staff to really ensure that, we're not getting sort of hit with surprises, that we're not seeing interventionist policy, as you've mentioned, and really trying to keep the operations running as smoothly and with as minimal kind of intervention, or at least change in intervention over the life cycle of a mine. Beyond that, definitely work in a lot of communications and public relations, which I think we'll talk about in a little bit. But that, what does that mean? That's executive visibility, it's media relations, social media, all the sort of corporate and digital communications. Another facet, I think, of the communications realm, which is maybe a little bit more unique in the mining space, is looking at risk management, and that's looking at jurisdictions where there may be asset acquisition or looking for new risks in an existing sort of jurisdiction that where a company may be operating. And so, from that standpoint, the secondary to that is also a lot of crisis management, which I've had a unfortunate amount of experience with in my career, both within the mining sector and beyond, and a number of very complex situations, as you can imagine, on a range of issues. And then more broadly, looking at the range of stakeholders that one might need to engage, whether it's governments, interest groups, that sort of thing. And so, that's really the complex of a public affairs team. So I've employed that and worked in mining, as you've mentioned, for sort of 15 years in a variety of capacities. I spent some time with Yamana Gold, helping to run their external affairs team prior to their acquisition in 22. Ran my own company where we had a number of juniors, mining suppliers. The government of Chile asked us to help promote their kind of mining program in a particular couple of years, where we got them more media coverage at PDAC than they had gotten all years prior, which was a big accomplishment. And then prior to that, I actually worked with PDAC, and I led their government relations and communications program. I led their rebranding and helped really elevate and amplify their not just domestic political engagement, where we would have 4 or 5 kind of MPs that would wander around the convention floor, to really to I think it was 53 or 4 members of parliament, including the prime minister. For the first time ever, 8 cabinet ministers spoke. It was quite an exciting and very entertaining endeavor, but certainly had a lot of work to go into doing that. But I think that's sort of a summary, and I think in the time and space that we've got, that's probably useful.
Yeah, no, great. How do you see public affairs functions supporting, obviously, the various aspects of mining companies, and how do you ensure it isn't silo and actually adds value as a truly cross-functional discipline?
It's a great question, Rob. Working in public affairs, I see this role specifically in mining, which may or may not be known for its silo operations. If, as a public affairs professional, I'm kind of working in my own silo, I'm going to be ineffective. I can't be effective unless I'm working collaboratively. And so, I had a conversation recently with a former, recently retired mining CEO, and he said, "Listen, the role is really a conduit that provides that and instigate a knowledge transfer between a company and the government stakeholders. And it's really got to be an informed conversation. And you can't do that as a public affairs person. I know a little bit about mining after 15 years, but there's lots more that I can share. And so the real value that I create is a translation of what the corporation needs and what the government needs, and finding those real wins that can lay kind of under the rocks, if you will. There's a lot of opportunities, and as we'll talk about more, I think in the podcast, we're really looking at an unprecedented time where this kind of work, this relationship building between government and companies, in particular mining companies, is more critical than it's ever been.
I would like to welcome our sponsor, Hawcroft. Founded in 1992, they provide property risk management services to the mining and other industries, using their knowledge, perception and expertise to offer true foresight across all aspects of mining and infrastructure. Their insurance risks surveys are recognised as the industry standard, as their reports are comprehensive, ensuring underwriters are well informed of risks surrounding your operation and quality control of those risks. Working with some of the biggest mining companies in our industry and across 600 sites, Hawcroft offer insurance risk surveys, construction risk reviews, asset critical and specialty assessments for a variety of mining, processing, smelting, materials handling, power, refining, port and rail operations. So if you're looking for a premium bespoke property risk management and risk engineering service, then contact Hawcroft today or visit their website at www.hawcroft.com. All details are enclosed in the show notes accompanying this episode. And I suppose in your work, dealing with obviously political leaders around the world, what are those themes and trends that you've seen which relates to obviously mining, and what do governments really need and want from mining companies? And obviously there'll be different governments around the world will obviously want different things, but if there's anything that's, I suppose, similar from most governments around the world.
Sure. Yeah. I always kind of view governments as a corporation. They have their own interests, they have their own strategy and their own series of objectives. And the reality for any mining company is to find the right complement of messaging and objectives and really kind of get into that concentric circle with them. Having had this conversation with elected officials from Argentina to the Netherlands and African nations and others, they're looking for partners. And really what we've seen over the last decade, maybe longer, is and I won't sort of lay this at the feet of mining companies, but relationships with government have tended to be very transactional. Governments are not interested in transactional relationships where you come to me, solve my problem, and then we'll move on and you won't hear from us, right? They want a real, meaningful relationship. Here in Ontario, where I live, we've gone through some Mining Act regulation changes. And, it was conveyed to me that the industry could have been more ambitious in terms of what some of those Mining Act regulation changes. We've got a mines minister here who thankfully spent a long time in the mining industry. He is a deep expert. His chief of staff and his team all have a great expertise. But when the sector came in, they were very cautious. They were very perhaps a little bit more timid than they needed to be. And so, really it's the ABCs, right? Be ambitious, be bold, and be constructive. But moreover, I think it goes back to that relationship piece, right? It's really, really about being present. And, if the pandemic taught us one thing, it's about the kind of chemistry that can be created when governments and companies work together. Mining companies often work in some of the most remote parts of the world. And during the pandemic, these were areas that were completely unserved and at, huge risk given the vulnerability. And certainly while I was with Humana, there was an enormous effort to ensure, that these communities were taken care of and that they had the services and the resources that they need to get through the pandemic. And sometimes that just meant keeping an operation open so that there were paychecks flowing out into the communities. And sometimes it meant providing healthcare for local communities. And I think these are the kinds of things that mining companies tend not to talk about as much. There's this sort of gophering, metaphor, that's been used in the industry where if I pop my head up as a mining company, I'm more likely to get it sort of lopped off by a stakeholder or a government. I don't want to be a target. And I think we maybe need to change that narrative. And I think we've seen some of that work happening. There's been some companies that have been more bold and more ambitious. And obviously it has a benefit to their own visibility and obviously to share price as well if it's good news. But that's really, that's the essence of it, right? It's creating real, strong, powerful relationships. Governments are looking for trustworthy business partners that can execute. I think that it's got to go beyond that message of, we're bringing jobs, we're bringing revenue and taxation, that sort of thing. Like that's sort of table stakes. We need to do more as mining companies to really exemplify how we can actually help governments move forward and how we can help communities move forward. And I take a personal example of after the really tragic incident in Brumadinho, the Brazilian, National Mining Agency came to us while I was with Humana and reached out to me and said, we're in a challenging way. There's a lot of political pressure to make substantial change. They came forward with a list of tailings regulations that were really going to be unpalatable to the sector, not because we weren't willing to do them, but because we knew that the government didn't have the capacity to even take in or manage the data that they were asking for. And so we worked together over the course of about 3 months. And again, that was intense pressure after so many deaths, but there was this intense pressure to kind of come forward with things. And we wanted to make sure they'd done their research. So we sat them around the table, members of the National Mining Agency, and it was the Mining Association of Canada, the Canadian Dams Association, and some of the other operators in the country. And we just compared kind of the regulatory regime. Where were their wins and where were their losses, or when were there opportunities to improve regulation, to tighten it up to kind of the best in class and global standard. And this was enormously powerful for the ANM to go back to then the Bolsonaro government to say, listen, like we've done an analysis. There's some policy instruments that we can change, but ultimately, what came of that, Rob, was a really, really powerful industry government-led coalition that said, listen, this is best in class standards, and obviously they went forward with litigation and that was helping to relieve some of the pressure as well. But we just wanted to make sure that they had the best in class kind of regulations.
2024 was obviously a challenging year in the market, especially obviously in the mining industry. And a lot of it was obviously politically motivated. What are those shifts that you're seeing in the market where you think public affairs could be essential in supporting the corporate objectives of some of these mining firms?
Sure. It's a great question. And, given the volume of mining companies that operate internationally, these are key questions for them. 2024 saw what is being referred to as an election super cycle. There were 74 national elections in 2024. 1.6 billion people went to the polls to vote. And it was not an incumbent friendly outcome for a lot of these governments. I mean, I think in the UK, you saw 14 years of conservative, government, lost the Labour Party. In Botswana, they turned over after 60 years. South Korea continues to be a bit of a disaster, unfortunately. In South Africa, the ANC failed to get a seat or failed to win a majority in their National Assembly for the first time since the end of apartheid. So what we're seeing is substantial volatility politically. And continued uncertainty. If we look to Germany and we look to kind of what's going on in France, what that creates is an environment where your sort of stable operating environment as a mining company could be disrupted very, very quickly, because all the government would need to do is start pulling on the threads of taxation policy or labor policy, for example, as happened in Argentina in 2021. And that can be obviously out of the kind of cost environment, because now you've got something that's completely unpredictable. And how do we manage that? Because our cost escalation has gone in. And so the role for somebody like me is to go in and really make sure you understand, if a new government is coming into play, how do we manage that? What is the influence that we can have prior to anything being happening? Who are the other members of a National Assembly or state assembly or however, wherever this resides, and impact and influence change. And I think that, in my career, we've been quite successful in being able to manage and articulate mining's position and the need for that sustained, reasonable kind of policy, whether it's environmental, labor, tax, export policy. And so again, with so much volatility, it sort of throws trade relationships and foreign policy up in the air, which again can really have a dramatic impact on domestic policy. But really where this comes from, and this is where, and we'll I think continue to chew away on this, is this notion that in the kind of the developed world, there's been some research, and that something in the range of 70% of adults believe that their domestic economy is in bad shape. And so that creates a lot of turmoil for governments, and it really captures a lot of their attention, so that they can't, have kind of a broad view, is that it's very sort of singular, and they tend to make more, maybe rash decisions about how to fix these things, because again, the instantaneous nature of politics is we've got to fix things immediately. We can't kind of let things roll out for a period of time until they get resolved, with sort of modest sort of policy advancements. It's really something that they look to as something as we need to fix it straight away, because that's what the electorate is demanding. So, that I think is probably key. I think is just the volume of volatility, where we're looking at in terms of, foreign affairs and trade relationships, obviously with, President-elect Trump coming back into office after being able to sort of sit and reflect on his first 4 years in office is a little bit unprecedented, but he's coming in kind of guns a-blazing. So, I think those are probably the big things on a global geopolitical scale.
Yeah, I suppose following on from that, obviously, what impact do you think President Trump and his obviously administration will have on the mining sector? And I suppose if you look both in the US and internationally.
Yeah, I think that's the $1 million question, right? And I think the former will be easier to predict than the latter. Trump's coming in after, like I said, sort of sitting on the bench for 4 years, watching kind of the Biden administration and seeing kind of, reflecting on his first 4 years in office, and then, which he was a bit surprised, I think, when he won. But it'll be volatile. It'll be unpredictable. He will swing kind of in his opinions on foreign policy based on kind of who, who's influencing who. And I think that he's, unlike in his first administration in 2017, he's going to surround himself with individuals that are really of the same worldview. He's not having to kind of embrace the Republican kind of administration that was kind of handed to him, because that caused a lot of problems in his first administration, right? There was so much chaos internally in his office. I mean, I think, if I remember the sort of senior advisors in the White House, they went through 44 in 4 years, and then 26 members of his cabinet. I mean, this is it's a circus, and it's hard to move anything forward when there's so much internal chaos. And what we're seeing now is that I think he's already lined up with a group of people to take in as members of cabinet and senior level officials in his government that are, as I said, really of his worldview. I'm quite keen to see kind of how Elon Musk plays out and for how long. I don't suspect it'll be for too long. But the nature of his erratic policy making will be unpredictable at best. And I think that's where mining executives really need to keep their kind of lens focused on where he's at. And it can be really frustrating. I had another mining executive who I talked to say, what you do, it's not legal, right? It's not, it's not environmental it's not this straight linear line. Politics and public affairs is, very circuitous, and it's sometimes hard to digest when you see things happening. And so it is, however, a necessary evil, right, to keep your mind on it. So in terms of where Trump will be on mining policy, he's already committed to expediting permits for anybody willing to invest $1 billion in the US. My sense is that's probably more geared towards oil and gas than it is specifically for mining. But both, I would say, going into the campaign, both Trump and Kamala Harris had very kind of pro-mining policies. And I think that the question I would ask is that unless Trump does it by executive order, which he may or may not do, I think his first day in office, there's going to be an entire new, sort of phone book of executive orders of things that will change and have dramatic consequences, both on domestic and foreign policy. But when we think about if he kind of goes through a more standardized process, the regulatory change process in the US could take 18 months, almost maybe 24 months to change. And so, I wouldn't hold my breath for things to happen quickly or overnight. I think it'll take some time. Because by the time he gets that in order, he's going to be then racing towards midterms at that point. And so there's a lot of these sort of like external factors that could influence that. The latter part of your question around foreign policy, however, again, I think just it remains a kitchen sink full of, unknowns, right? There's this notion of decoupling with China, and sort of this self-reliance, this America first policy that Trump has talked about. And that's great. But again, it's the uncertainty of, one of the first people Trump invited to his inauguration, was the Chinese president. And so it sends a lot of mixed signals to the market. And I think that stability is something that he's going to need to manage is sort of that market. I think he's made some bold sort of proclamations around significant changes to the Inflation Reduction Act and a number of other sort of key pieces of legislation. And, again, it's this tinkering with a baseball bat sort of metaphor that I think, he's running the risk of creating a more inflationary environment because of tariff regimes and sort of domestic policy. So I think it's going to be very, very unpredictable. And I think it's going to be very, very challenging for, a lot of the cross-border stuff that we've seen. But again, we'll have to sort of see exactly how it shakes out, but wildly unpredictable is what I would say.
Yeah. If we look across the border into Canada, obviously there's a lot of mining companies and operations across the width and breadth of Canada. And we can't avoid talking about what's happening in Canada at the moment and the unsettled nature of federal politics. How do you see the next year or this year shaping out, obviously specifically within the mining industry?
Yeah, for sure. As much of a circus as it's been in the United States, or what we anticipate being a circus, Canada has just been equally as bad. Our conservative opposition have been filibustering in Parliament for the last sort of 2 months. The one thing we know is there will be an election in 2025. What we don't know is when. 70% or so of Canadians want the Prime Minister to resign. His approval rating is less than 30% right now, and a growing population within his own caucus, where depending on who you talk to, it's between 35 and 50% of his caucus are asking him to resign. This is not a great situation for the prime minister. We're in sort of parliamentary recess at the moment. The earliest sort of eyes we'll have on this is end of January, and potentially an election as early as in March. The prime minister is holding on, I think, in terms of what the best guesses are right now, because he feels he's best positioned to negotiate with President Trump. President Trump, even prior to obviously his installment as president, has talked about how he's going to interact with Canada. Tariffs are going up. And so Prime Minister Trudeau has been sort of traveling down to Mar-a-Lago and sending his senior officials in government down to sort of deal with the incumbent Trump administration. All of that with this kind of undertone of people don't really want the prime minister around. Our finance minister resigned the day she was meant to deliver a budget document. And, so it's not a great environment. It doesn't position us particularly well. So, I would have this conversation with a mining executive and they'd say, so what? This doesn't really matter to me. Let's get through the circus. So, my next piece is really, well, okay, well, then what? We're looking right now at a Pierre Poilievre conservative government here, with a clear majority, will be much more ideologically aligned with the Trump administration. I think when we look at how that might play out for the mining community, listen, there's 14 or so mining companies listed in Canada. It is 200 or so operational mines still in the country. And we have provincial governments of all kind of political persuasions looking for more mining. And so with a Poilievre government federally, I think, we would see a similar treatment, although I don't think we can guarantee the same kinds of regulatory change, although I think that there are a number of pieces of federal legislation that Poilievre, will probably look to, easing for the sake of mining and oil and gas production. Again, how long is that going to take to get through? Probably similar timelines to the United States. So, nothing right away, but I think we'll see some very, very positive things happening in probably the sort of 26, 27 years.
Shifting gears a bit, as a large portion of the role of your role is obviously public affairs. What are your views on the changes we've seen in the media industry and how media relations, both in terms of obviously promoting corporate objective and reputation management? What are some of the changes that you've seen in the industry?
Well, I think we've all witnessed it, right? I mean, I think first thing is that, media relations and media attention, eyeballs, is an important and valuable weapon in the arsenal of a company looking to promote themselves, right? And that's mining. But what we've seen is a dramatically shifting landscape in the media sector as a whole. Certainly in the United States, just as kind of a litmus for kind of what we're seeing globally. Keep in mind that in 2023, we saw 2.5 media outlets, newspapers, local, regional, or national, 2.5 of those close every single week throughout the course of 2023. And by this time last year, the United States had lost a third of its newspapers that they had in 2005. So that's a dramatic shift. And I think that, what we see is in erosion. We talked a little bit about this earlier, is this erosion in kind of public trust around democratic institutions, sort of trust even in courts and the judicial process. This is all kind of compressing. And so the trust in the news media, the traditional news media, is also in decline. And so what that creates in not just in the United States, but around the world, are these sort of information deserts where people don't have access to regional information. And it makes it very difficult for mining companies or other, specifically resource companies, to get their message out because there aren't the local publications, and you're relying on sort of playing a game we're not particularly comfortable with. We're long stories, we're long narratives, as opposed to going to TikTok and saying, here's, 15 seconds of kind of who we are and what we do. So we need to adjust, we need to shift to that and sort of, as the expression goes, fish where the fish are. But, it requires an internal shift for media, for sort of media relations programming, and a conversation with mining executives to help them understand that landscape has shifted dramatically. There are less editors, there are less publications, there are less journalists covering mining particularly, but business news generally, and it makes it much more difficult to get that kind of attention. And so you need a much broader strategy that that you may not have needed 10 or 15 years ago, that you could go on kind of name brand recognition, fire a press release off on a newswire, and you would get coverage. Conversely, I think what we're also seeing is a rise in citizen journalism, which makes it very, very complicated. Anybody with a kind of a cell phone and a drone and a blog is a journalist, and they don't have the same requirements for providing unbiased information. And so you could throw a drone up over a crowd of protesters outside of a particular mining project, and that creates an enormous opportunity for brand or reputational damage, even if it's just a generally peaceful crowd. So the reality there is that I think it's being more sophisticated in the approach and being able to manage and navigate how mining companies engage in media, in particular social media and the digital channels. And one of the things when I was with Yamana, we had a very investor friendly website, as most mining companies do. But I encouraged our senior leadership to open up a page, a channel to those looking for kind of non-investor, non-production results, page, and we started publishing kind of some of our ESG stories and all of those good things that we were doing and putting it out there, because again there was so much competition for space, and there wasn't always a kind of a reference point of this is our perspective, this is our message, this is our story. And so I think companies need to be more nimble and be a bit more thoughtful in terms of how they engage with the media.
Yeah. I suppose just moving on from that and looking at a broader perspective of mining as an industry. And I ask this question again to many of the guests that come on the show, the branding of mining. And what people around the world think mining is. And a lot of them think it's unnecessary. They think it's a dirty industry. We can go on. How do you think the industry should tackle this and improve the image of mining as a brand across the globe?
It's a great question. And I know that a number of organizations have struggled with this. I was on the board at the Ontario Mining Association, and I was on the board with the Canadian Mining Association as well. And these are real material issues, right? Because the challenges that operators face is kind of an archaic vision of mining. And, this I've done some work with, organization here that sort of goes into the classrooms, that talks to kids about mining opportunities. And, sometimes what we're dealing with is, the literature that kids read, the textbooks and the course material that they get and young grades is really skewed in terms of the perspectives on mining and where, there might be a paragraph on, open pit and a paragraph on kind of underground mining, and then 5 or 6 pages on how horrible it is for the environment. And so there's a real education process that needs to happen. And, while I was with PDAC, we did some actually public research, and it wasn't quite as bad as I thought. We saw a hesitation on behalf of, we did some focus grouping with just sort of random Canadians, and it wasn't quite as bad as we thought in terms of people's knowledge or understanding about mining. I think there is a view that, oh, well, if we just recycled more, and we know that that's not going to overcome the dramatic increase in utilization for smartphones and technology and things like that. There's some offsets you could find there, but it's nowhere near enough to be able to actually move the needle. And so I think from that standpoint, I think this goes back to our first question, right? It's working in partnership, mining companies, mining associations, and aligned associations, I would say as well, but also with government to sell a singular message that, mining is an environmentally friendly cause in many respects. If you want more electric vehicles, you need 3 times the amount of copper that we currently have, because the EVs require it. You need more ethically sourced cobalt, and the Canadian Mining Association has done some really good work with companies like Apple and IBM in terms of securing more ethical sources of cobalt. So I think it's always about incremental growth, but this need to to consolidate. And what we've seen here in Canada over the last decade or so is a federal government who has said, kind of anything but mining. We don't want to talk about mining. And so it's really doing the best we can in terms of educating them as to the value of mining. And I can think of a conversation that I had with in the midst of the pandemic, with the Quebec mines minister who said, listen, we got to shut you down. Like, the operation has to cease. And I worked internally with our team and eventually brought forward a health and safety plan that, in their words, exceeded their expectations. But the thing that really triggered it for him and the premier to say, yeah, we can greenlight mining again, was that the strip in the COVID tests is it requires gold to actually make it turn color. And I say, wouldn't it be better that was Canadian gold or gold from Quebec? And sure enough, that that was a winning argument, it seemed. But I mean, they knew that the revenue had to come, and we couldn't sort of keep our every element of the economy shut down for a period of time. But sometimes it's about translating that message and realizing that there's a common need here, and it's nice to focus on green energy or sort of advanced manufacturing, but there still has to be the inputs throughout the whole supply chain. And so it's an important question. I don't think it's one that has been solved quite yet, but I think working with like I said, in a collaborative space with all the different actors in the sector is really, really vital to that.
Yeah. What's your view on artificial intelligence in either supporting or obviously perhaps replacing the public affairs function?
I may show a bit of bias in answering this question. I think there's always room to improve process. I think there's already that work underway, managing timelines, managing kind of accuracy, and there are some great tools in the marketplace to do that. Because I think it's the last thing a mining company wants to do is kind of bring in this kind of new team of people, where if you can offset some of those headcounts with technology, then that's great. I think AI offers an enormous opportunity. I think we're really just on the cusp of kind of really getting fulsome understanding of the power of AI in the workplace. But public affairs, and again, this is maybe my bias, right, is that it's the exclusive domain of the relationship. And, it's very, very difficult to use AI to engage a journalist for a story. You can't use AI to kind of reach across the table and shake a stakeholder's hand. And you can't really understand kind of the political motivation unless you're sitting across the table from an elected official or a senior government. So I think there's a lot in the supportive elements of AI. And I think that there's already companies that are bringing that in for stakeholder management and building that sort of thing out. But until somebody builds a public affairs terminator, I think I'm pretty okay for a short period of time anyways.
Yeah, I think we have the same conversation and arguments and challenges with even the industry that I'm in recruitment. Will AI replace recruiters or headhunters? And we have the same conversations as well. And the thing is, I think it comes down to being personable and your personality, which AI can't replace.
100%. It's, to your point, it's exclusively a relationship-based business, right? Stakeholder relations, media relations, public relations, government relations. These are all things that require time, energy, investment. And, frankly, there are some offsets, probably like HR and finance and others that you could do with some automation and some process improvement. But the reality is that they do still require a very human touch.
Yeah. What do you think strategically about public affairs? And what advice would you pass along to executives facing obviously certain challenges during 2025 and its role within their organizations?
Well, great question. I think, if I'm sitting across the table from a mining executive saying, this is a really important opportunity. I think, we've talked about some of these concerns. I mean, the mining industry as a whole is facing a number of challenges. We've seen enormous commodity price fluctuations in 23 and then in 24. I think we saw the top 40 mining companies were kind of 7% down in terms of revenue expectation. And where public affairs can come in is really helping to calm some of those instabilities that are outside of the sphere of a mining sort of operation. So working with those stakeholders to be able to predict, be able to anticipate what some of those concerns are so that we can respond and act in accordance with that, as opposed to what many companies do is they end up in a very reactionary situation, which ends up always costing you more. And I think that, when you look at, some of the areas for, where we might see, metal prices, for example, is that, I think the World Bank is predicting kind of price declines through 25 and through 26. May change. I think we'll have to watch that. But I think we're seeing slower economic growth. We're seeing kind of, the volatility in public policy, like where will Trump be on sort of ESG? Where will he be on sort of the low carbon economy? Whereas the entire mining sector has kind of made this hard shift into it. And I think, there's an opportunity there to sort of take a pause and reflect and see kind of, well, where is that going to go and how do we deal with that? Nonetheless, I mean, shareholders still want to see, a great return for value. And so there's a cost compression that we're seeing throughout mining companies and the ability to do more and more with less. So creating greater innovations and greater sort of cost containment. And again, I think that's something where public affairs is relatively underutilized, right? Being able to, work with governments on particular tax policies or, financial incentives for, kind of regional development, looking at infrastructure offsets. I mean, these are all sort of fundamental to kind of the public affairs envelope. And I think it could be really, really beneficial. As we talked about before, for junior companies, raising capital has been enormously challenging. I think we're looking at, as I think you led the show off with, right, is that these regulatory hurdles that we're going to see or could see in a world of changing governments is something that could come with an enormous cost profile for mining companies. And so being able to sort of manage those and navigate those with an articulate kind of vision of, these aren't factories, right? You can't just pick them up and move them, right? This is sunk capital that is, in most cases, kind of the number one employer in the communities where they operate. And so I think, if I'm thinking about 2025 is going to be a world of volatility, of great unpredictability, hopefully some economic recovery, but I think they're still thinking it'll be kind of June, July before we see kind of more improvement on that standpoint. But the one thing I think that, mining companies have been very, very good at in terms of their thinking and their process is thinking quarter to quarter to quarter. And I think where they could benefit, in greater context is thinking a little bit longer range in terms of the external environment and how it plays out in terms of the profitability.
Obviously, you're an expert in public affairs and communications. Question that's come up a few times, especially with guests that I've had on the podcast that have expressed this concern, maybe offline rather than online when we're recording the podcast. And I suppose it is more so with some of the junior miners that are struggling to raise finance, that they are continuously going out, promoting, they've obviously have a pitch deck or they're promoting their business and their company, but they seem to be regurgitating the same information. And sometimes I think, and I've had, there was a couple of instances where a guest has said to me, I suppose they're sounding, they hate hearing their own voice, saying the same thing over and over again with no visible effect because they're still raising money. And I just wonder if you can give any advice to maybe some of these junior miners that are struggling to raise finance, and they're out treading on the pavements, going out meeting various people, going to various conferences, doing in their presentation, but it seems to be the same presentation. They may change a few things, but in essence, it is the same information that they're putting out there. I just wonder if there's any advice that you can give in terms of how they could maybe differentiate their presentation, how they can maybe make it sound a little bit more interesting, so they in themselves don't think they hate hearing their own voice repeating themselves over and over again.
That's a great question. I think, if you're tired of hearing your own voice, then let somebody else's voice speak for you. And by that, I mean, talk about kind of your social license to operate in the community that you're in, and let the voices of those communities come forward. If you have, other, investors who are obviously keen, and share your enthusiasm for a project, let them tell the story for you. I've seen, certainly in my several years with PDAC, seen a number of those presentations, and they all look the same. They're all formulaic in that sense, and the winning argument isn't being at PDAC or at Minds and Money. It's not just being there, right? It's actually telling a different story. These projects all have incredibly rich stories that go along with them, and oftentimes, I think, for a variety of reasons, we just get to the same kind of core diagnostic elements. And I think being able to move outside of that as a presenter, being able to tell a bit more of a rich story about, what's the mission, what's the vision, what's the intention of this project, and being able to give it a bit more personality would be enormously helpful, as opposed to, here's the geology of the project. And, for some, that's going to be really, really powerful, and they're going to take a lot away from that. But, as we used to say, like, we had the government of Chile as a client when I was running my own agency. And, I said, anything that you can put on the website isn't going to get media attention. Anything you've already put out into the public space is not going to get media attention. What you need to do is tell something new. Tell them a news story. Hey, this is a really kind of interesting element of the project that, for some may not be as compelling, but it's different and it's new, and it's really brought forward in a way, with the use of video and supporting with social media. I can think of, when I was at PDAC, and we were working very aggressively to build up our social media footprint, and did so in short order. But the reality is that, it was difficult because there were so few juniors in particular, because it's not something that they necessarily think about, right? But maybe they should, right? In terms of being able to promote themselves and take smaller chunks of that same story, newer stories, new techniques like video in particular, and being able to push those things and use them in presentations. I mean, being able to have this kind of liquid content that you can put in a variety of different places, so you're really only paying for it once, but you're able to use it on multiple platforms is really, really critical. And like I said, I've had good success, especially with limited content, being able to turn it into some communications gold.
Lastly, I wanted to just give us a quick summary of some of the things like political risks and trends to watch out for in the coming.
Sure. There's a lot to think about. I think we've talked about probably the biggest one, which is sort of Trump 2.0. I think what we're probably looking at here is a fair bit of domestic chaos. Whether it's mass deportations that he's talking about, border security issues. It'll be interesting to see where Trump sort of falls on green energy and climate change. But his insistence that he could solve the Ukraine-Russian war in a day with a phone call is something that I'm sure we're all very interested to see whether or not it materializes. But on a broader concept, I think where the U.S. kind of lands on sort of foreign policy and in particular in the Middle East, I think we've got a number of sort of issues there. There's conflict and a United States response in Africa and through a variety of other sort of conflicts. I think at the last count, there's 60 conflicts, like regional conflicts around the world right now. And the US plays a big role in those. And so Trump has said, listen, our relationship with NATO, we're putting them on notice. And as a country, Canada has been kind of put on notice as well for not making significant enough contributions. And so what are those relationships? What are those alliances going to look like? Again, with Trump, I think, what is his economic strategy going to look like, and how will it impact the markets and create stability or not? I think, it comes down to just sort of, adding back into the foreign policy piece, right? It's foreign aid. Where is he going to be on that? And where we've seen some receding investments by the United States in other jurisdictions. beyond that, I think, watching, the sort of the China, Russia, North Korea, Iran kind of, clustering is really going to be interesting, because it's how is the world going to react to that? And when it becomes the central preoccupation of a federal government, it means that they have less time and attention for things like mining investments and things like that. And so it's where are federal governments, and to a lesser degree, sort of state or provincial governments, where is their time and attention being spent? But I think as a result of these sorts of things, we're seeing enormous imbalances globally. I think we're looking at, as I mentioned, I think, these sort of 60 odd kind of global tensions, and they're kind of, these microaggressions that we're seeing. I mean, even if you take it on a smaller scale and look at kind of what I think some are sort of classifying as sort of domestic terrorist acts. I mean, you saw what happened in Germany, and you've seen, there were a couple of incidents in the United States this week. And, these sorts of things that are popping up all over the place, I think is really an undercurrent of a social dynamic and a social pressure where, from kind of the early 2000s, and we had the kind of 1% movement, and then we went through the recession in 08, 09, and people are feeling like they're not getting further ahead. And the reality there is that there's this intense pressure now, not just on sort of the lower socioeconomic groupings, but on the middle class as well. And so people are feeling like they can't get by. And so this is where you see the volatility in federal and national legislatures that will also then sort of work its way down to the state and local levels as well. Again, I think we're now seeing Germany's going to go to an election. And so seeing how all of those global actors then kind of resettle and what their priorities are as it relates to mining, I think is going to be enormously challenging. And the relationship here is to the mining audience is a good friend of mine, a former boss twice. He used to say to me that, after his 4 decades in mining, that, all the easy stuff's been found. And now we need to go further afield. We need to go deeper, and we need to go in more volatile sort of zones. And so, with all of this uncertainty, and with all of the volatility in the market, the volatility on commodity prices, and now all of the political volatility, you have to wonder, like, how many companies are going to willingly take on these new risks. And so then it becomes an issue of, well, who will take those risks, right? Will China be willing to go and mine in a more sort of combative kind of zone to further their dominance in, whether it was, they're the leading producer of gold in the world, I believe, and, or if it was in critical minerals or wherever it might be. And so there's all these sort of foreign and domestic policy issues that really, come to the table. A couple others, final, I think global warming will continue to play a trend in terms of the sort of the political discourse. How large it will play, I'm not really sure, and whether or not it's going to kind of be the front and center priority that it's been over the last sort of decade or so. I think and certainly in the advanced countries, from a security standpoint or a risk standpoint, I think we see things like corporate reputation continues to be a concern. Things like microaggressions against companies, cyber attacks, and business interruption and continuity issues, I think, continue to be a concern. Where this will really play out, I think, is in terms of, the company's ability to kind of think again strategically and longer term in terms of how they navigate some of those issues. And as we mentioned before, I think rising costs and keeping sort of cost containment under control is vitally important for mining companies, always kind of with an investor lens. And then, as we talked about briefly before, I think as well is this notion of resource depletion, and then those competition for reserves. So I think those are probably some of the bigger issues. Happy to chat more if you want.
Yeah, no, it's certainly a big challenge in a year ahead for any industry, for the economy. And obviously we're just focusing on the mining industry. There's so many challenges, obviously political, markets, commodity prices, recruitment, not enough skill shortages. There's so many. It seems our industry, probably more so than any other industry, have more and more challenges, and they continue to build upon challenges that have always been around. It just seems an ever increasing circle that we're going around with these challenges. But we, as an industry, we still push through these, keep trying to solve these challenges, and do the best that we can with the resources that we've got, and dealing with various governments around the world, but we continue to push through. So Steve, really appreciate your time. Thank you for coming on, sharing your insights into political risks that are around the world. I'm talking about obviously public affairs, branding as a mining industry, and obviously talking a little bit about the social media. If our audience wants to reach out to you, if they've got any questions that they may want to propose to you, how can they go about doing that? How can they follow some of the work that you get involved with?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think if you've got my contact information, if you want to maybe put that in the chat box below when you post it. But yeah, stevevirtue@icloud.com is my email. And I'm always happy to chat with people. I think there's a number of companies that really hesitate in building these relationships, but I will tell you that they really, really do matter with the regulators and with with the public officials, because it's important that they understand these projects in a way that I think most mining executives would like, but keeping in mind that these folks, they're not geologists, they're most of them lawyers and community citizens who are trying to kind of understand mining, and the more conversations we have with them, I think the better off we'll be.
Yeah. Again, thank you for your time. Hopefully we'll have a positive 2025, and perhaps you want to come on later on in the year or even beginning part of next year and give us an update, because I'm sure there'll be a lot of different conversations and different thoughts that you'll have as the year progresses.
Oh yeah, it'd be interesting to do kind of a mid-year recap for sure. But I will say, and as maybe your viewers have seen, the sun is shining. I keep getting blinded by it, but hopefully that the sun is shining on 2025 for all of us.
Yeah, fingers crossed. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed the episode. As always, appreciate your continued support. Please keep sharing these episodes far and wide. And obviously, with this particular episode, we've covered a number of different topics. And I think this episode can relate to a lot more people in our industry. So please share it with colleagues around the world, within your companies, and to also people outside of the mining industry. As we mentioned about branding, the only way that we can improve mining as a brand is by sharing information with people outside of our industry, because people may not know what mining is all about, and they will only know by sharing these episodes far and wide. So thank you again. Continue listening, and until next time, happy mining.
Thank you for listening. Remember to reach out to Rob via the show notes, and be sure to subscribe and leave a review. Until next time, happy mining, helping each other to improve the mining industry.